It was written on November 6th, 2014. Today, I had a siesta, but it was a busy one. As I slept, I dreamt. And as I dreamt, I traveled 6,000 miles to the east and 56 years into the past. I found myself in the bedroom of my childhood home at number 9 St. Joseph's Park, Mayfield, County Cork, in the year of our Lord, 1958. In my dream, I was busy trying to rearrange the furniture in the room which I shared with my two brothers, Seamus and Pádraig. It consisted of a bunk bed with me, the firstborn, on the top, and Seamus on the bottom bunk, while Pádraig, the 6-year-old, had a narrow cot to himself. I was trying out a variety of arrangements of these two beds to optimize the free floor space. When I awoke from my exertions, I realized that the two greatest illusions from which we humans suffer are space and time. All other illusions follow from these two. When I say illusion, I don't mean to say that they are not valid experiences, but rather that they aren't ultimate reality. My little siesta knocked both time and space onto their butts. The space illusion creates the myth of physical separation. For example, I see myself as distinct from you, from rocks, from enemies, from friends, from God. This sense of separation only begins to heal when we access our causal bodies, begin to experience our psychic powers, and start to realize that we are much more connected than we are divided. The time illusion creates the myth of temporal separation. We break up our experiences into past, present, and future. What we take to be a here and now experience is actually a there and then one. As humans, we can't actually live in the now. The best we can do is inhabit a time slot which is nanoseconds removed from the now, because that's how long it takes for our senses to drink in data and pass them along to our brains for processing. This creates the perception that we take to be the experience itself as it is happening. But by then, the event or the scene has already slipped into the very recent past. Our eyes can only grok 1/10 trillionth of the total light spectrum, and then our little brains process that tiny sliver of data that actually makes its way through the senses. Imagine trying to create a map of reality from a 10 trillionth of the data after they had been mangled by our tiny little brain processors. It's the equivalent of opening the play Hamlet and picking out a single word in a single line in a single scene and then speaking that word to a hamster and asking him what he thinks of Shakespeare. Meanwhile, we make our pathetic little reality models, inflate our narcissistic chests like roosters atop a dung heap, and crow that we are the king of the hill. Rather than calling ourselves Homo sapiens, we might better call ourselves Homo hubris. Let's try to find a way out of this chutzpah-riddled minefield. What we call matter is really manifestations of various densities of light, and what we call mind is really manifestations of various densities of sound. So then, the journey of enlightenment is literally the elevation of our awareness into more and more subtle or less and less dense levels of matter and mind, until finally there is only the song of love, where ultimate light harmonizes with ultimate sound to produce original love. This original love is God. It's not that love is an attribute of God, but that God and love are just two words for the ultimate reality or source. It is only by transcending the senses and the brain, in fact, by transcending the entire space-time continuum, that we can have mystical experiences which propel us into the dimensions where love is Lord. A word inspired by, I have no idea. About 10 days ago, somebody sent me an email with an article. I don't know if any others saw it or read it. And this article was about a 79-year-old Bostonian priest with an Irish name who had a near-death experience. Any of you guys read that article? Seems like I'm the only person who got it. And in this article, it says that this man had surgery and was dead for 48 minutes, 79-year-old priest. And during that, he had a very powerful near-death experience in which he met God. And he came back and he reported that he had met God and that God was a woman. And he intended to go back to his parish and spend the rest of his priesthood preaching that God was a woman. But as soon as the Archbishop of Boston got to hear of this, he rushed to God's defense. And he wouldn't allow the guy to go back to his parish, be preaching this kind of heresy, and he very vigorously defended God's gender. Now, I don't know whether it was true or not. Somebody told me a few days later that it was actually a spam. I have no idea whether it was or wasn't. But it appeared in the newspapers somewhere. And as I was processing it for the first few days, I'm thinking the following. I'm thinking, okay, so at least it represented some kind of an improvement in this man's theology. He'd gone from patriarchal thinking, where God is some kind of a distant, demanding deity, to an understanding that God is a compassionate mother. So, yeah, it represented a huge advance in his thinking. But he's still stuck, because he's still ascribing gender to God. But at least it's a huge improvement on where he was. And then looking at the Archbishop, I think his name is Sean Patrick O'Malley. And he's rushing to God's defense, that how dare you insult God by ascribing feminine gender to him. And I'm thinking, my God, that guy is really, really, really badly stuck. Now, I have no idea whether it's a true story or not, or whether it's just a made-up spam, but I got it and I read it in a newspaper. So I want to look at that phenomenon today because in some senses, it is ludicrous of us to ascribe gender to God, or in fact to ascribe any characteristics whatsoever to the ineffable source. But we need to use metaphors of various kinds to represent our experiences of God. So God per se is a transcendent, ineffable reality. But we all have experiences of God. And we need to articulate these experiences in some kind of metaphoric language. So there are some aspects of God which are best represented by masculine metaphors. Maybe that God is a great technician who created all these wonderful things. But there are other aspects of God which are much better represented by feminine metaphors, like compassion or mother, or forgiveness, stuff like that. So we employ all these metaphors as long as we realize they're not actual, descriptions of who God is in itself. And so one of the great attributes of God, for which feminine metaphors have been long employed, is the notion of wisdom. And I want to treat of wisdom today. Wisdom is the core point of the homily today. So I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to just define a few terms to make sure that we're on the same page and that you understand, what I understand by the terms I'm going to be using. Secondly, I'm going to give you a brief look at how the word wisdom is used in the scriptures and where it came from. Then thirdly, I'm going to have a deeper look at the notion of wisdom. Then fourthly, as I mentioned here, I want to show how time and space are related to wisdom. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with a kind of a modern metaphor for wisdom. So that's where I proceed this morning. So the first one then, I want to look at a few terms. And these are terms you've heard me define in the past, but they're important for purposes of understanding the homily today. I want to differentiate between fact and truth. You've heard me say many times that my definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is radically true if it transforms me greatly and aligns me permanently with God. So truth for me is not the same as fact. Truth is that which transforms me and aligns me with source. So there's a huge difference then between truth and fact. Because something can be factual but not true. And something can be true but not factual. So, for instance, it's now 10:09 a.m. on Sunday morning. That's a fact. It's not true. Are you radically transformed by the information that is now 10:09 a.m.? Yeah? It goes straight over your head. So it's factual, but it's not true. It hasn't changed you in any way whatsoever. If I take, for instance, my favorite example of something which is true but not factual, it would be the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is Jesus talking about the notion of who is my neighbor. And he tells the story, he says, there was a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he fell among robbers. They beat him up and they stole all of his stuff and left him half dead. And as he was lying half dead on the ground, a priest passed by from the temple on his way down to Jericho, and he saw this fellow Jew all beaten up, and he just passed by. And a few hours later, a Levite passed by. The Levites were the temple police. So he sees a fellow Jew lying at the side of the road, and he just passes by. Some hours later, a Samaritan comes down that road. Now, the Samaritans and the Jews were deadly enemies, going right back to the destruction of the first temple in 597 BC. And this Samaritan man is passing by, and he sees this Jewish man lying half dead on the road, and he attends to him. He pours oil into his wounds, and he puts him up on his own donkey, brings him down to Jericho, checks in at a hotel, looks after him for 2 or 3 days, and then says to the hotel keeper, I've got some business to transact elsewhere, so can you make sure he's getting food and you're looking after him, and I'll pick up the tab when I come back. And that's the story Christ tells. Now, is that a true story? I think very true. Is it factual? I don't believe so at all. So, for instance, if you were a reporter from the Jerusalem Post and you heard Jesus telling that story, and you said, there's something really fishy about this story. So you go over to the temple and you knock at the door, and the high priest comes out and you say to him, I have a question. I'm from the Jerusalem Post. And I heard a guy talking about one of your priests who went down to Jericho in the last few days, and he saw somebody lying at the side of the road, half dead, and he passed him by. Can you check that out for me? And the guy goes back in, the high priest goes back in, and he says, listen up, dudes. Any of you guys down in Jericho in the last week? No. There was none of them in Jericho. I thought as much. So you go over to where the Levites live, and you knock at the door, and the head Levite comes out, and you say, I just heard a story that one of you guys was on his way down to Jericho a few days ago, and you saw a man lying at the side of the road, half dead, and he just passed by. Can you check out that story for me? And the head Levite goes back and he says, listen up. Any of you guys down in Jericho in the last week? No. You come back and says, no, didn't happen. And then you go all the way down, you schlep it all the way down to Jericho. And there's like 6 hotels in Jericho. And you knock at the door of each of the hotels and you say to the manager, by any chance did a Samaritan man come in here in the last few weeks with a Jewish man who was really, really beat up and pay the bill for him and look after him? You've got to be joking me. I certainly remember that. Didn't happen in my hotel. So you go out to all the hotels and you get no. Never happened. And you come back up and you meet Jesus and you say, bloody liar. You made it all up. So was it factual? Not at all. Was it true? Absolutely. For the people who heard that story, it was radically transformative because they understood for the first time that your neighbor is not just the guy who has the same citizenship or the same passport as you. Your neighbor is anybody who's in need. So there's a huge difference then between fact and truth. Now, this is the distinction then between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is the ability to be factual, to understand the physical cosmos in which you find yourself and to be able to manipulate it and survive in it. But wisdom is very different. Wisdom is the understanding of the metaphysical origins, the underpinnings of the physical universe. So wisdom is to truth what knowledge is to fact. So knowledge is just the ability to understand the physical cosmos and to make our way around in it. But wisdom is the ability to make our way around the metaphysical universe. And that leads to transformation. The other one just leads to facts. We can do a whole bunch of stuff with facts. So that's the first point I'll make. Just a few definitions. So I had to look for a few minutes then at the notion of wisdom as we find it in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And it has its origins in Hebrew. It's called Shekhinah, and in the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and wisdom is called Shekhinah, which is a very feminine term, and all the pronouns used of it in today's readings and elsewhere, they're all feminine pronouns. The New Testament is written in Greek, and the word in Greek is Sophia. And Sophia, again, is a very feminine term. And all the pronouns used of Sophia in the New Testament are all feminine pronouns. So the notion of wisdom, very, very differently, throughout the entire Judeo-Christian scriptures, is very definitely a whole bunch of female metaphors and female pronouns. But where did it come from? It comes into Judaism, I believe, during the Babylonian captivity. In 597 BC, the Babylonians came in and they conquered Jerusalem and they deported the king. And they installed a puppet in his place. But in 587 BC, the puppet roared and attempted a revolution against the Babylonians. So they came back in and they flattened the city and they destroyed the temple. And they deported the entire population off into Babylon. And they remained in captivity until the year 529 BC, when the Persian Empire overthrew the Babylonians and released a remnant of the Jews to go back into the land of Israel. And then they started building the second temple. But during that period of exile, when they're living in Babylon, they come under the influence of a great Iranian religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism had a huge effect on the evolution of Judaism, and through Judaism, on the evolution of Christianity. And Zoroastrianism had basically reduced the polytheistic pantheon of gods, many gods, down to two divinities. There was a god called Ahura Mazda and a god called Ahriman. And Ahura Mazda was the god of light, and Ahriman is the god of darkness. And all conflict in the world happens as these two gods struggle for supremacy. So they had reduced the entire pantheon of gods down to two. Judaism would embrace that and then finally fine-tune it down to just one God, who now has to be responsible for both the light and the dark, and for evil and good, which creates its own problem that's called theodicy, of why do bad things happen to people. But they're using Zoroastrianism, which had reduced all the gods down to two, they bring it down to one. And from Zoroastrianism, they learned for the first time about the notion of life after death. And then learned about the notion of angels and spirits, and they bring back that to Jerusalem with them afterwards. Now, some of the population embrace that and some don't. The priests don't, the Pharisees do. The Pharisees are lay theologians, and the priests, so even at the time of Christ, there's disputes going on, and the Sadducees try to trick Jesus on the question of life after death, because they don't believe in life after death, or spirits, or angels, whereas the Pharisees did. Now, I actually think personally that the word Pharisee itself is cognate to the word Farsi, which is the language of Iran. So that the Farsi party, or the Pharisee party, were the ones who embraced the Zoroastrian thinking at the time. So they bring this back to Jerusalem with them. But it's at this stage in Judaism that you get the completion of the Bible. And the Bible in Hebrew is divided into three sections. And there's a kind of an acronym. Am I using the correct word? An acronym? Yeah. An acronym called Tanakh, T-N-K. T stands for Torah. And Torah represents the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which were traditionally ascribed to Moses. That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The second one, N, is for Nebi'im, which is the Hebrew for prophets. It's the same word in Swahili. Nabi in Swahili is a prophet. So the second section of the Hebrew Scriptures has to do with the prophetic literature. Beginning with people like Elijah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Isaiah, people like that. So there's a whole second section is called Nebi'im. And then the third part is called Ketubim, which again is a Hebrew word meaning books. And we have exactly the same word in Swahili. In Swahili, a book is kitabu. And so the third section is called the books or the writings. And it's the wisdom literature of the Bible. The third section of the Hebrew Scriptures is the wisdom writings. And it's books like, we read this morning, Proverbs, Ecclesiasticus, Wisdom, the Book of Wisdom. And they're philosophical musings on the great existential questions. This is the first time within the Bible that you get a real look, deep philosophical looks at the great crisis people experience in life, sickness and death and what happens afterwards. And they got that idea completely from Zoroastrianism. And so the third section of the Hebrew Scriptures is based upon what they learned from Zoroastrianism about how to engage with the existential questions. So all the great books of wisdom in the Hebrew Scriptures are, based on their experiences with Zoroastrianism. So that's the biblical background to the notion of wisdom, or Shekhinah, which is a feminine word. Now, the third point I want to make then is I want to go a little bit deeper into the notion of wisdom. So if you look at evolutionary biology on our planet, basically you start off with rocks. Jerry talked about, the first reading this morning, right up his alley. This is Jerry's expertise, rocks. He's a geologist. And then, so you've got rocks. What rocks, in some senses, the only way they can react is through some kind of a biochemical, response to environmental, situation. The sunlight or rain or wind or whatever. So rocks are basically responding to the environment in a predetermined biochemical fashion. Particular rocks will respond to particular environmental ways because of their own composition. So that's the first stage in the sense of physical evolution on our planet. Then at some stage you get the evolution of plants. And plants have the ability to respond in a kind of a more instinctive fashion. There's an element of kind of free will, in a sense. Plants can move around. They can orient towards the sun, for instance. And so they can open up or close down like, our California poppies do. So there's an ability, a pre-programmed instinct as to how they respond to environmental situations. Then at some stage came the mammals. And the mammals introduced the notion of emotion. Mammals are the first animals that have actually emotions. Reptiles don't have emotions. Reptiles don't dream, they don't raise their young, and they don't have emotions. So the mammals were the first to build emotions into the equation. And then with Homo sapiens came the notion of reason or logic. So we go from kind of just biochemical response to a pre-programmed instinct, to emotional response, to logical, inference and deduction, stuff like that. Now that trajectory hasn't ended. And as we reach the limits of every stage of that evolutionary process, some new species arise to build in some brand new feature into the complexity of the evolutionary trajectory. But we think that we've arrived at the end of the journey, and that with the arrival of reason, we've maxed out. That evolution has maxed itself out. You only have to open your eyes to realize just how much doo-doo reason has gotten us into. Every major crisis on planet Earth right now is because we have divinized reason. Reason and logic and that level of intelligence is what creates weapons of mass destruction. It creates pesticides, and herbicides of various kinds. It's created ecological destruction. It's created warfare of various kinds. It's created economic models of extraordinary injustice whereby 6,000 children die of hunger every single day. It is reason that's created all those things. Now, I'm not saying that reason is bad, but I'm saying that reason, if that's the end of the road, we're going to go extinct, as much as the dodo did. Human beings will become an extinct species if we don't develop trans-rational abilities. And so some species are going to emerge that will develop trans-rational abilities, and those who don't develop it will fall by the wayside. There will be evolutionary cul-de-sacs. So what does trans-rational look like? It does not mean abandoning logic any more than when we became rational, we abandoned our emotions, or when we became emotional, we abandoned our native instincts. All these continue to be part of the equation. And so the further evolution always incorporates the previous stages, but it transcends them. It incorporates, but it transcends. And that is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom is when we reach into the trans-rational. Wisdom is the place that takes us into the metaphysical and realizes that if we stop with just reason, we're going to literally wipe ourselves out. We're in danger, actually, of wiping out a whole bunch of species and maybe even doing irreparable damage to the planet itself. But we'll certainly wipe ourselves out of a species if our evolution stops with the development of reason. Reason has gotten us into all these kind of situations. That's my third point. My fourth point then is the purpose of this little essay I wrote as a result of the siesta on November 6th last year. I do not think that we can understand wisdom until we come to the realization that both space and time are an illusion. And by illusion, I don't mean that they're not real. They are real, but they're only real at a particular level of the dream. A few Sundays ago, I talked about the various levels of dreaming. All of us are constantly in a dream. It's only a question of which dimension of the dream are we in. And every level of the dream is real. But not every level of the dream has equal valence or equally important. So we have to realize that time and space are artifacts of a particular level of the dream. But if we have to understand wisdom, we have to learn to go beyond identification with time and space. And that was the whole purpose of this little essay that I wrote down here. Now, there are two great examples of that in the life of Christ, it seems to me. The death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ are both extraordinary exemplars of what happens when you transcend time and you transcend space. And so I've used this example with you many times. If you take the cross on which Christ was crucified, you can see this as an instrument of torture, or you can see it as an instrument of transformation. So I've said many, many times that I'm totally convinced that the vertical arm of the cross is the connection between the immanence of God and the transcendence of God, between the below and the above. The horizontal arm of the cross is the brotherhood, sisterhood of all living beings. It is how everything is connected. And where the two pieces intersect is your own identity. You are the intersection between the dialogue that goes on between the immanence of God and her transcendence, and between the dialogue that goes on in the brotherhood, sisterhood of all living beings. And your sense of identity comes from that intersection point. And so the cross is the symbol par excellence. Below, above, as far as I'm for me, represents, transcendence of space, and before, after represents transcendence of time. So the cross for me is not an instrument of torture. It's an indication that, salvation or enlightenment happen when you learn to go beyond time and beyond space. Now, as you're incarnated, you have to learn to live in time and space, but not identify with it. And finally, the resurrection of Christ has the very same characteristics. The disciples who encountered Jesus after his resurrection were desperately trying to find metaphors and images to explain to people that the Jesus they met after his resurrection was exactly the same person they'd known before he died, but that there was something radically different at the same time. So they had to employ a whole bunch of images. And biblical scholars divide these images into two categories. They call them the before-after images and the below-above images. So the before-after images are trying to impress upon them it was exactly the same guy. It was Jesus. He ate fish with us. He spoke to us. He told us, put your hand into the nail marks. So it was really the same Jesus before and after. So before and after, that's transcending time. But they used the below-above images to illustrate the fact that even though it was the same Jesus, there was something radically different about him. He was transformed utterly. He could appear or disappear. He could dematerialize and rematerialize. He could put on all kinds of guises. He could walk through closed, locked doors. And so that's the below-above represents, transcending space. So both the crucifixion and the resurrection are graphic exemplars of how Christ was able to transcend time and space in order to come into full enlightenment. Which brings me to my last point. I'm going to use a metaphor, and I'm going to need Lee Britton to help me out here. I only studied computer science for a very short period of time at the beginning of my college career in 1965. And I was learning a language called Fortran. I don't know if it's still, is it still there or is it gone at this stage? A museum piece, just like myself. Okay. So imagine for a few minutes that you're a software engineer and you actually invent a brand new computer language. And then a fellow software engineer takes this language and he uses code. He creates a code to develop an application. So the first guy invents a language, the second guy uses this language to create a code to invent an app, and then the third person is you and me, and we know how to use this app, in a Word document, to write a letter, or to kind of do an Excel spreadsheet, or whatever, or to find our way in a GPS. So you and I, we have no idea what the code is. We wouldn't recognize code if it jumped up and bit us in the backside. And we certainly would not be able to invent a language, but we're able to use it. Now, using an app is the same thing as having knowledge, whereas inventing an app, creating the code, or writing the language is the same thing as wisdom. And so in modern terminology, the mystics and the wise ones are the creators of the language and the creators of the code, and the knowledgeable people, who are not very, very wise, are the people who are just using the apps. Okay. Did I get it right? You got it good. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you.